Hello, I'm Silvia. I'm one of the archivists here at LSE. We're very pleased to have you all here tonight. So it was 100 years ago, on 23rd of April 1924, that Giacomo Matteotti came to London on a nearly secret visit to rally support with Labour against the fascist government in Italy. Here he met a representative from Labour government, from the Independent Labour Party and trade union, and he gave a speech at the trade union TUC conference on 24th of April. Only a few weeks later, after he'd gone back to Italy, he was kidnapped and murdered by a fascist squad on the 10th of June 1924, just around the corner from his home in Rome. We're here tonight to commemorate Matteotti, but in particular, we're here tonight to talk about some documents that we have here at LSE Library that play a significant role in the understanding of Matteotti's murder, what preceded it, and what followed it. You may have seen the documents upstairs already. If not, you'll have a chance to see them after this seminar. And I'm going to introduce you quickly to the documents, and then I'll leave you the floor to the other speakers who will talk about the significance of them. So what are these documents? Here's the part that never works. Okay, I'm just going to quickly do this. Okay. So here are the documents. So after Matteotti was kidnapped, an investigation took place, and within a few days, the main magistrates who worked on the investigation, who were Mauro Del Giudice and Umberto Tancredi, they knew that he had been murdered. His body was only found later on in August. Within a few days, they also identified the main perpetrators and all the people involved. The documents that we have here, to use Salvemini's words, are the most significant parts of the evidence collected by the examining judge in this inquiry, and include things like examination of the defendants, witness statements, memoranda, and similar documents. It is indeed a selection of them. There are 5 volumes, but the whole documentation was about 40 volumes. These are 5 volumes, and there are about 4,000 sheets. Why they're here? Because many opponents of the fascist government at the time had come to London, or indeed had fled Italy, either forced to or by choice. One of them was Gaetano Salvemini, who was an academic who at the time had left Italy after he was working at the University of Florence. And he had published a lot of anti-fascist material. He came to London in 1925, and just a year later, in 1926, he managed to secure a copy of the preliminary inquiry documentation from Modigliani, who was the lawyer of the civil party in the Chieti trial that followed, and Zanotti Bianco, who was an historian and a social activist in Italy. And he deposited them here. And we have, and I'm going to have to do this. Here is where the library was. I thought it would be nice to show. This was where the LSE was. Here is the plan with the library and the room. This is about in the 20s, so it's actually at the time. And if we move on to the next, please. Here we have Salvemini, who wrote a letter to the librarian, Bertie Hedica. And in this letter, move forward again, twice again. In this letter, autograph letter by Gaetano Salvemini, he says, I'm returning £25 check that I borrowed from LSE, and I think this £25 was possibly what Salvemini used to pay for the documents. In a later document I'm going to show, we see that it's an article from the Westminster Gazette, and they say that Gaetano Salvemini paid about £20 for the documents, so that possibly it is. But he goes on and mentioned that he has these documents, some books relating to economics, some pamphlets, sheets that were published in a clandestine way, and the records of the preliminary inquiry into Matteotti murder. And we also have the minutes of the library committee at the time from February and March 1927. And here it says the specialist precautions have been taken with regard to the custody of this item, and that only inquiries with a letter of exceptional recommendation should be allowed to consult the documents. And in any case, it should only be under direct observation of one member of staff. So this obviously indicates that the library knew that this was a very important, very important documents. But also it could be an indication of the fact that the night after the documents were deposited here, there was an attempted burglary reported by Salvemini. Is the only mention we could find is Salvemini in an article in 1955 says there was an attempted burglary. So obviously someone wanted these documents. And the last thing I wanted to show you is the Westminster Gazette article from the 12th of January 1927, where not only says that the documents were lodged here on the 7th of January 1927, but it also says that they contain unquestionable proof that the murder of Matteotti and the concealment of his body was instigated by the fascist government, and that Mussolini himself was directly implicated. After being informed by the consul in London that this article came out, Mussolini wrote immediately to him saying, it's not possible, the documents are here in Italy, there cannot be a copy in London. But he was wrong. The documents were here and still here today. And today we're hoping to get a new attention to these documents from scholars, researchers, and the general public. We're also digitizing the documents, so we're hoping to make them available online in the next few months. And we believe that the documents are as valid today as they were 100 years ago. Thank you.
So this is a drawing of Matteotti that is emerging from the fog. It's the fog of London, because obviously there was fog that day. And yes, the title will come. And thank you everyone for being here.
You need to be in front of the camera, no?
Yes, but then
I can go over there.
Thank you. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Silvia, for the introduction. Can you go to the next slide?
Next slide.
Yes. Maybe ask.
Here. Which one is it?
No, it's on Chrome. So
let's see here.
Yeah, fantastic.
There we go. Okay, so it's working.
There you go. So yes, I am Andrea Pisauro. I'm a neuroscientist from the University of Plymouth. Today, I speak also in representation of the Matteotti Committee London 1924-2024, which is a committee which was created in London by a group of progressive organizations within the Italian community in the UK to remember and honor the memory and the legacy of Giacomo Matteotti. And in the next 6 minutes or a bit more, I will try to cover the 6 months that go from the Matteotti's murder to the end of Italian democracy. so bear with me. So we already mentioned, I don't know where Silvia is, but there you go. The visit of Matteotti to London. That visit was the visit of a socialist leader. Matteotti was the secretary of the Italian Unitary Socialist Party, who was on a secret mission within a European tour. London was the main stop of this tour. It was here particularly because there was the first ever Labour government at the time. Among the things he did was also find a publisher for his book, detailing crimes of Mussolini's government, which he did. And he met the executive committees of all these different organizations. And as Silvia was saying, he was denouncing fascism as a threat to democracy and was calling for assistance, really. There is also some suggestion that he might have gotten some documents from the Labour comrades that were evidence of corruption in the fascist regime. But then who was Matteotti? Matteotti was a political leader. He was standing in parliament and he was the main opponent of Mussolini. Here is the famous speech that he gave on the 30th of May 1924. That day he denounced the April election of the same year, and the results of those elections are corrupted. Those elections were marred by violence. He gave a very long list of facts, people and places in which candidates were prevented to stand, meetings were prevented to take place, people were prevented from voting. During the speech, he was constantly interrupted, shouted at, insulted by 300 fascist MPs looking at him, including Mussolini. At the end of the speech, he went to speak to Giovanni Cosatini, a colleague of his, saying, now prepare my commemoration, because the climate of violence that he was experiencing was suggested to him. That day in Parliament, there was a lot of people in the audience. Among those, there were Cesare Rossi, who was the director of Mussolini's press and propaganda office, and Amerigo Dumini. Dumini, that is a big cut there, was the head of his political police. They were heard shouting insults at Matteotti, including, for people like Matteotti, you need to have a rivoltella, a gun. There were clear threats, and in the LSE documents that we have above, there is multiple references to these threats from different independent witnesses. We know a lot about what happened on the day of the murder. He was kidnapped on his way to Parliament in broad daylight at 4:30. There were 5 men, some suspicion there might be more than 5, but we are not sure. They were led by Dumini. They were waiting in a car. The car was rented from the director of a fascist newspaper called Corriere Italiano. We know this because we have several witnesses, again, that saw the scene and reported a movie-like abduction. They were observing it from different angles. None of them thought it wise to intervene. None of them thought it wise to go to the police. They only go to the police a few days later when he was on the newspaper. Anyway, the car sped away. Matteotti would never be seen alive again. That's the place, the road where he was kidnapped with a lot of people a few days later. After the murder, and we know this from the LSE documents, the murderers came back to the Corriere Italiano headquarters. They spent some time there discussing what to do. They went there with the car that they used in the kidnapping, which was a Lancia. It wasn't many cars at the time. It was a fancy car at the time. The same car was placed by independent witnesses at Palazzo Chigi the night before and at the Viminale the night after. Palazzo Chigi was the seat of the government where Mussolini was staying, also the foreign affairs minister, and the Viminale was the home office. So this car was in the palaces of power. Dumini himself had a card through which he could access both buildings, and he was well known by people in those buildings. The day after, Rossi and Mussolini learned about the murder in the morning. We know that the wife of Matteotti, that stayed awake until the morning, went to report his disappearance in the afternoon to Modigliani, who was a fellow MP of Matteotti. Modigliani goes to the police to report the disappearance. The police already knows. They knew from fascist MPs, because the fascists all knew what had happened that day. They were talking to each other, there was gossip. So, you know, pure Modigliani went, Matteotti disappeared, we know. The country discovers the disappearance between the 12 and the 13. This is the cover of the Avanti, the socialist newspaper, on Friday, 3 days later. We don't know what has happened to Matteotti. He was kidnapped in full broad daylight. But then on the 12th, something happened that is very significant for the events that followed. The car registration number is reported to the police at midday. This was from two concierge of a hotel next to the house of Matteotti. And immediately after this event, Mussolini, that the previous day didn't want to say anything about Matteotti, was joking with colleagues that, you know, he must have gone abroad. He was very dismissive. He's suddenly very worried because he knows that the car registration number has been found. So he goes to Parliament and tells MPs, we are very worried about Matteotti. We are doing everything we can to retrieve him. And then the following day, he meets Velia Matteotti, and he tells her too, we are very worried about your husband. I hope we can find him. Of course, he knew he was dead already from the morning before. But then the country knows that the situation is very problematic because Domini himself is arrested on the evening of the 23. The link was the car. The car was registered to a garage. The garage was linked to the director of the fascist newspaper, and Domini was working at the fascist newspaper. So it was very easy links. Domini is arrested, and then Mussolini starts to describing the crime as diabolical crime on the 13th again to the parliament. And he needs a scapegoat. So he asked Rossi, who was his closest aide, to resign. But things don't go well for Mussolini because an anti-fascist judge is charged with the lead of the investigation. And the first thing that this guy, which was a judge, and he was called del giudice, which means of the judge in Italian, anyway, he orders the arrest of Rossi and Marinelli. Rossi and Marinelli were the two closest aides of Mussolini. So the country knows that there is a judge chasing Mussolini's inner circle. And the judice also makes a very crucial decision. He investigates everything that these two people, Rossi and Marinelli, and the political police and Domini have been doing for months. But crucially leaves Mussolini out of the investigation, which will have consequences later on. But he does that for a good reason, but we don't have time to discuss it now. What we have time to discuss very briefly is that the opposition, which was outraged, as outraged was the country, makes a crucial mistake. They were divided on everything, but they all agreed on the bad things to do, which was the Aventino succession. They decide to abandon parliament. They said, we're not going to rejoin parliamentary work until there is clarity about what happened to Matteotti. And this was an attempt to put pressure on the king, Vittorio Emanuele III, to tell him, you know, dismiss Mussolini now. It's clear that he's involved. But the king feared them, the Republican leaders of the opposition, more than he feared Mussolini. So he doesn't do anything. In July, suddenly, Matteotti comes back from the dead with a phenomenal article that is reproduced above on English Life, where he accused Mussolini again of many things. His words are read, really. We don't have time to discuss it now. But when the opposition goes missing, Matteotti is still there. Even if he's dead, an article comes out from him. And it's the last piece of writing on Matteotti in life. Then in August, Matteotti's skeleton is found. It's found by a carabiniere just after Ferragosto. But in reality, it's a retrieval which is orchestrated by the government for two reasons. One, that they wanted to show goodwill to the country, saying, you know, we are finding the corpse, we are helping the investigation. But of course, they knew where the corpse was, so it was easy to find it. But also to delay the investigation, because once a corpse is found, then you need to interrogate those that have found it, understand how it got there, and there is a few weeks will pass. And they needed to gain time because the judge was building his narrative, was understanding what had happened. After the corpse is found, the coffin is carried overnight. The funeral is rushed through to close the chapter immediately. And yet, a lot of people go and mourn Matteotti. But then the evidence against Mussolini grows weeks after weeks. we come to November and December. In November and December, Filippelli's and Rossi's memoirs are published. Filippelli was the director of the Corriere Italiano, the guy that provided the lunch. And both Filippelli and Rossi accused Mussolini directly of giving the order of the murder. And their testimonies is perfectly consistent with the key accounts that other people in the regime gave, and that are also in the LSE documents. So Mussolini gave the order. The country is outraged again. And that's why Mussolini ends Italian democracy. He decides that the pressure will be too much, he needs to say something, he needs to do something. The speech of the 3rd of January is a direct attempt to take responsibility for the climate of historical, political, and moral delinquency of fascism and close the matter of the murder. There is no discussion anymore. In the next 48 hours, everything will be solved. And in the next 48 hours, free press is abolished. The local police has the power to shut down local branches of the opposition. Italian democracy is over. And also the trial becomes a farce. The anti-fascist judge is removed. There is an amnesty for all political crimes that was referred to as the Dumini amnesty, such was the blatant purpose of it. The trial is moved from Roma to a small town in Abruzzo on the mountains, difficult to go to, Fastissima. And just to be sure, the new judge was the brother-in-law with a major fascist person, and everyone is acquitted. Dumini minor sentence is free in a few months. Velia Matteotti will say, "I did not have justice from men, I will have it from history and God." She writes a letter to the judge in charge saying, "I relinquish my mandate to keep investigating." So this was one of the most consequential political assassinations in modern European history. In fact, countless authoritarian regimes, from Hitler to Putin, were inspired by what Mussolini did that year, and also the methods he employed to normalize violence and to bring it to a next level. Mussolini's responsibility were never fully accepted by a part of Italian historiography and Italian political spectrum. In fact, Matteotti remains a ghost for a large part of the Italian right, including the current government. There is still some debate about the motive, whether it was just political, killing a political opponent, whether he did have this evidence of corruption that he might have got from the Labour Party, and also whether his international connections were also important, because this guy was talking to the Labouring government in England. It was dangerous for that. But today we want to pay tribute to a European martyr of democracy and also think about how to say never again. This is in German as the slogan of the German movement, anti-fascist movement in the last few weeks. Thank you.
Let's see who's. If this works, yes. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for organizing these events. I'm Alice Gustoni. I'm a lecturer at the University of Oxford, and I've been devoting the last let's say 8 years of my life, more or less, to this guy, Gaetano Salvemini, and to his anti-fascist activity in the UK. And today, Silvia mentioned about his involvement with the Matteotti documents, but we will try to say a little bit more about his involvement with how his anti-fascism is linked directly to the Matteotti murder, and how these documents are relevant to Salvemini, why he decided to leave them to the LSE, and let's try to say something more about how the documents reached LSE and about Mussolini's reaction to the document as well. So the Matteotti murder was a turning point in Salvemini's anti-fascist activity, because until that moment, Salvemini was clearly anti-fascist in his political view, but he was kind of waiting to express his political stance, because it was disillusioned about Italian politics. He had an experience as a politician, and now he decided just to stay, to keep waiting about the fall of Mussolini. But when the Matteotti murder changed the political scenario, Salvemini decided to do something more. With a group of anti-fascists in Florence, they founded the Non Mollare. The Non Mollare was a political journal, a clandestine journal. You have seen copies of the Non Mollare upstairs. And this bollettino di informazioni was disseminated in Florence in a clandestine way. And the Non Mollare was the instrument through which Salvemini and his fellows anti-fascists tried to oppose the fascist dictatorship in Italy as much as possible. We are in 1925, of course, so it was really a difficult situation. Also because after the Matteotti murder, Mussolini imposed censorship on the press. So the Non Mollare became, Salvemini at some point says, the Non Mollare became even more important than the Corriere della Sera, because Non Mollare was the only paper that published the Memoriale Filippelli. So the Memorandum Filippelli was, as Andrea mentioned, was published on the Non Mollare #5, and they distributed like the double of the copies that they were used to publish. And so the Non Mollare gained a lot of importance in Florence and in Italy as well. But importance comes with a price, because of course the Non Mollare was publishing more and more issues about the Matteotti murder. At the same time, they managed to overcome the fascist censorship, but this also meant that they were attracting the attention of the fascists. And the publication of the Non Mollare is exactly what cost Salvemini the arrest. So Salvemini was arrested, imprisoned, and he stayed in prison for a month. Then he was released because the trial didn't go through, because there was a lack of a person that could testify against him. And Salvemini at that point, he decides to leave and go to the UK. But what we have in the Non Mollare, not only the Memoriale Filippelli, but also part of the Requisitoria Santoro. So this part was bought by, this document was bought by Salvemini in Rome for 250 lire. And he bought with him in exile this document in his suitcase. So basically he leaves for the UK and keeps the most important things with him. So the documents on the Matteotti murder. And then while in the UK, in October 1925, he sent back some excerpts of this Requisitoria Santoro for publication in the Non Mollare. So there was a letter by parts of the Memoriale of Cesare Rossi, letters by Dumini, all documents accusing Mussolini directly of his responsibility. So this shows us how much the Matteotti murder was key to Salvemini's anti-fascist campaign. But why LSE? Salvemini reached London aiming at the beginning to stay just for a while, waiting for the dust to settle down after the trial. Then he realized that it's impossible for him to go back to Florence. And why he chose Great Britain? Because in 1922 and 1923, actually, Salvemini managed to come to Britain a couple of times just to visit the country, to understand politics. He was really interested in British culture because of Mary Berenson and Bernard Berenson, who were art historians based in Florence, that were the key of his intellectual link in Florence. But Mary Berenson was Alice Russell's sister. And so Mary Berenson literally gave Salvemini the money to go to the UK for the first time. And then Salvemini falls in love with this country and decided that his exile could take place in Britain. Why? Because meanwhile, he managed to get support. While he was in Britain, people, intellectuals, were writing letters to Salvemini in prison saying, we are supporting you, we are trying to help you. And they tried to help, actually, because they also promoted a diplomatic intervention with the British ambassador in Rome, who spoke to Mussolini and said, look, people are talking about Salvemini, be careful about what you are doing with him. And so this is the key of Salvemini's interest in Great Britain. And Alice Russell was actually an early Fabian. So she was part of the LSE foundation in a way, and she has a link. She had links with LSE. And Salvemini in 1926, so Salvemini arrived in London in the autumn of 1925. Then he spent all the 1926 in London, and he stayed at Russell's. So basically, he was based in Chelsea, and in Chelsea, Alice Russell was hosting teas, meetings, lunches with influential politicians, and so Salvemini becomes involved in this political intellectual network. So it seems completely logical then, after he received these documents from Modigliani and Zanotti Bianco, he used these documents to write his first book on the fascist dictatorship. Having finished to use them, Salvemini leaves for the US at the end of 1926. He leaves on the 31st of December, so very last day of the year, and he goes to the US lecturing on a lecturing trip of anti-fascist conferences, and he needs a safe place to store the documents. So it seems logical that this safe space was exactly LSE. And his main contacts were Graham Wallace and Harold Lasky, that were constantly visiting Alice Russell. We have, if we read Alice Russell's correspondence, she was constantly in touch with her sister in Florence, and she keeps writing her sister, or there was the Wallaces and the Laskys visiting, and they spoke to Salvemini. So this seems the most logical link between them. How the documents reached LSE, that's the most difficult part to understand. Why? Because we don't have, of course, anything that says this person gave the documents to Salvemini and Salvemini gave them to LSE, because it was too risky to write it down in letters, of course. So we are just trying to make a hypothesis here. And the most helpful document here is what Silvia already mentioned, the article on the Westminster Gazette and the letters that Salvemini wrote. So from the article, we know that the documents were given to LSE on the 7th of January. So the article is of the 12th of January, but mentions that the documents were given to the librarian the Friday before, that was the 7th. Salvemini was already almost in the US, so it was not Salvemini that directly gave the documents to LSE, but a confidential friend of Professor Salvemini that is so much confidential that we still don't know who he is, in a way. So these documents, as Silvia said, were concealed behind the door. The librarian only knows where they are. And of course, they were worried about the documents. And it's interesting that the article says we made copies of these documents in relation also to the fact that there was an attempt to try to break into LSE, probably to steal the documents, and the fact that it was important to ask to provide unquestionable bona fides as to the genuineness of the intention of the people who wanted to see them. But another interesting point is that on 13 January, so the day after the article on the Gazette, Angelo Crespi, who was a friend of Salvemini and also of Don Luigi Sturzo, so another Catholic, a priest who was in exile in London as well, announced with a letter on The Guardian that the documents are available at LSE. So why Angelo Crespi telling, look, there are documents that can be used by interested people at the LSE, documents on the Matteotti murder? Maybe Angelo Crespi could be part of this process, also because Crespi was not an exile, was not probably, it was part of this Italian community in a way, but also very embedded into the British community as well. So he had the authority to say things that others could not say. And he was a journalist as well while in Italy. And so maybe Angelo Crespi is someone who we should look at more into details. Finally, what happened? That on the 12th of January, so through the article of the Westminster Gazette, the embassy in London understood that these documents were here. So the important thing to note here is that the embassy knows through the article on the Westminster Gazette, not through other sources. And so they tell the Ministero degli Esteri that these documents are at LSE. The reaction of Mussolini is, of course, it is a fictional sale without any truth and seriousness. It's impossible. We need to strongly and categorically deny. And Mussolini also says it's impossible. They are probably not genuine documents because the original documents are handwritten and these are typed copies. So they cannot be the real documents. This is typical of the fuoriusciti. The anti-fascists do such things. And so they dismiss this thing. But it's also, I think it's important that we cannot link the attempt of breaking into LSE directly to the embassy at this point, because if really the embassy just know through the article on the Westminster Gazette, probably, or there were other sources that we still don't know, but it's something that we still need to investigate. So how this attempt of breaking into, if the embassy just knows after the publication of the article. And finally, so the Westminster Gazette has to issue a disclaimer according to the Italian embassy instruction to say, okay, maybe we are wrong or maybe not, okay. And finally, just to conclude, so these documents shows us that Mussolini had a very important paid attention to the British context, and Salvemini's anti-fascist strategy was exactly putting pressure on the fascist regime from abroad. And these documents were part of Salvemini's strategy. It's important so to keep working on these documents and on this network that involved also the LSE. Thank you. This work now. Should work something. It seems to work. Yeah, I've spoiled the surprise. Hi everyone, thanks for inviting me to speak today. I did some of my PhD research at this library looking at the documents on the Women's International Matteotti Committee, so it's really nice to come back and share some of the work. So I'm going to kind of expand our focus a bit beyond London and kind of Italy, although I will talk a bit about Italy to start with, and think about what's going on internationally revolving around Matteotti's memory as a kind of foundation of anti-fascist protest immediately after his death. But before I do that, a bit of introduction to the kind of what we might call, I suppose, the memory wars around Matteotti's memory immediately after his murder. So we've already heard that his body wasn't found for 6 weeks. And so in that time, that created this kind of vacuum, I suppose, this kind of space in which anti-fascist or emerging anti-fascist, the emerging anti-fascist community could kind of come together and protest. And this is the site of his kidnap. And brave, I suppose, people immediately flocked to this site to lay these kind of red carnations and other red flowers as this symbol of emerging anti-fascist material culture. This was obviously not looked upon fondly by the fascist regime, which wanted to squash any anti-fascist kind of feeling and public demonstrations at this point. So they were met by black shirts who also kind of gathered around and organized kind of counter demonstrations around the site of his kidnap. Some of them walked from the point that he was kidnapped on the Arnaldo da Brescia to Matteotti's family home. And as they marched underneath his window, they chanted, "Con la carne di Matteotti ci faremo I salsicciotti." So like horrible kind of provocative and just, yeah, grim chants. But it really shows this kind of creation of like demonstration and counter demonstration that I think is going on in Italy at this point. And we've got records that show that there were demonstrations organized all over Rome, but also in other cities throughout Italy at this point. The regime responded by kind of banning commemoration, obviously, and trying to prevent this symbolism that's emerging around Matteotti's memory. So we know, for example, that Velia Matteotti, his widow, was ordered to take off her mourning clothes and stop wearing black as this kind of constant reminder of her husband's murder. And so scholars, including Stefano Caretti, have talked about this idea of like denied memory, la memoria negata, in response to Matteotti's death. And we really see memory becoming kind of part of the story, part of the battle, the symbolic battle after Matteotti's murder. I had to laugh when I read in an archive that the Swedish foreign minister, who was traveling to Italy in December 1924, so 6 or so months after Matteotti's death, had packed in his suitcase a red wreath that he wanted to lay at the site of Matteotti's kidnap. And he had kind of a slogan and a sort of banner that he wanted to lead there. And he asked permission from the fascist regime to do that, which obviously was not met with in the affirmative. And he was quickly turned around at the airport and sent back to Sweden with a rap on the knuckles, I suspect. But he was forced to kind of apologize internationally. He misread the room on that one, I guess. So this like suppressed memory thing, this denied memory, effectively pushes memory of Matteotti in Italy into domestic spaces. And this picture on the screen shows a police document that was lodged kind of about this guy, whose name is Leopoldo Brugnaro, I think. And he was thought to be a kind of dangerous socialist, and they investigated his house and kind of went through rummaging through his things, and they found this shrine that had been set up to Matteotti in his home, a portrait of Matteotti, the kind of classic parliamentary portrait that we're so familiar with, which was flanked by flowers and a candle, like a kind of religious shrine. And there are numerous kind of references to this in the archives. So much so that it even becomes part of the kind of cartoons that are produced in the wake of Matteotti's murder. I'll just look at my notes for the date of this. I think it's straight away, it's 1925. So yeah, this ban on memory really pushes memory within Italy into the domestic space, where people
keep these shrines throughout the Ventennio. And I've even heard stories told by people whose grandparents lived in Italy under fascism about kind of double-sided portraits that people had in their homes, where on one side it would be the parliamentary portrait of Matteotti and the other side would be Mussolini, and you kind of flip it if there's a knock at the door and you want to hide your anti-fascist love. So memory suppressed in Italy, but abroad it explodes. And that's what I'm really going to focus on now. So this is the Socialist Almanac, the Italian-American Socialist Almanac produced in 1925. And we can see from the front page that really the murder of Matteotti was kind of the defining feature of the year for them. And throughout 1924, so immediately after his kidnap, we have enormous commemoration ceremonies all throughout the states in the cities where there are large Italian populations, but not only, these are kind of workers' protests rather than just Italian-American protests, which I think is interesting. So the Boston ceremony, to name just one, attracted 10,000 people. So they're kind of large-scale events, these. I'll just talk briefly about this one in New York. So this took place, immediately after his murder. I think the date's 26th of June, so quickly. And 2,500 people attended. It reached maximum venue capacity, so a further 1,000 people were apparently outside on the streets, unable to get in. And I think the scale of that event is really striking, particularly given how small these events were in Italy because of the restrictions imposed by the regime. It's interesting to note as well, I think, that these events are publicized in English and directed at workers. So this is really about kind of international solidarity and the coming together of Americans as well as Italian Americans at this point. It was given a fairly negative review in the New York Times, mainly because it turns out that it was infiltrated by fascists. So at one point, when calls for America to take a stand against what's going on in Italy are made, and there are calls for kind of resignations of the Italian ambassador and so on, fascists then kind of jump up on chairs and start sort of attacking the anti-fascists who are present at this event. So it's thought, that it's been infiltrated by fascists as far away as New York. A note on that, actually, the image on the right shows the fascists in New York in the early 1920s. And I think it's important to remember that because it's not a kind of low stakes, you've got skin in the game if you're going to a Matteotti protest in New York at this point. The chances are that you're going to be met with violence or at least hostility by fascists who are in the diaspora. And Mussolini is quickly pumping money, time and effort into building support in the Italian diaspora around the world. And I suppose as a consequence of that, the efforts to fix Matteotti's memory in public space permanently really spring up in communities where there are large Italian-American populations, such as New York. So this image on the left, this is the editor, Girolamo Valenti. So he's the editor of a newspaper called Il Nuovo Mondo, which is published in the US, but in Italian, and it's an anti-fascist paper. Its primary focus is kind of talking about the regime, but interviewing kind of anti-fascist exiles or the emerging anti-fascist community in the States. And if you can measure the success of a publication by the kind of chaos it causes, this does quite well. It's the number of reports submitted to the Italian Foreign Ministry regarding these guys is high. So it had a circulation of around 30,000 copies by the end of the 1920s. So it's widely read. Anyway, so in 1926, early 1926, I think it was February, he launches a collection for the first monument to go up to Matteotti, which was planned for the streets of New York. And the article was titled, "A Work Worthy of All the Emigrants and Exiles of the World, a Monument to Matteotti." And Valenti calls for this monument because Matteotti, I quote from his call for fundraising here, is a symbol and not only in Italy. The time has come to show it. Avanti, Italians of North and South America, let's see out this sublime project, which will endure as a monument to the honest and unselfish love of emigrants for the sacred causes of justice and liberty. And so in his newspaper, he's asking for people to kind of put their money where their mouth is, really, and give donations to get behind the construction of this monument in New York. And within a few days, the tone of the paper really shifts, and they're just completely overwhelmed. They say, you know, we got into work the day after launching this fundraising call, and there was a queue outside of people handing over their wages, wanting to contribute to this fundraising. So they raise around $9,000 in the space of a few months, which is kind of extraordinary given that we're in 1926. And at the same time, there's a move for a monument to go up to Matteotti in Belgium. And they're very explicit over in the States that actually that's not what they want. They don't want this to be placed in the kind of I've forgotten what the building's called, the sort of workers' headquarters in Belgium. They want this on the streets of New York as a sort of declaration of what the Italian-American community is, and to sort of push back against the growing presence of the black shirts in the States. So the monument never gets built, which is annoying. I would really like a neat, happy ending here, but it doesn't ever get built. And I think that this is because the paper itself gets into financial difficulties and then gets bought up by someone who's pro-fascist, it turns out. And so is essentially kind of infiltrated and then dismantled from the inside. And that money sort of just stops appearing in the newspaper articles in the archive. So it just kind of goes cold. Yeah. So I'll just give one more example before I close to think about this kind of international response and quite how unstable, I suppose, memory of Matteotti is in Europe. So in these images, you can see what's called Matteotti Hof in Vienna. So Matteotti's name is given to this social housing complex, which was built in 1926 in Vienna by the left-wing mayor at the time, and it was, you know, deemed a kind of monument of sorts to Matteotti's memory to have this huge housing complex in his name. And you can see from some of these, you know, you can see the scale of it, but there are things like this, what would you call that? Etching thing, sgraffito. I can't think what that is in English, but anyway, that to Matteotti. There's other kind of statements, his famous quote that you can kill me, but the ideas, etc. That's kind of incorporated into the building itself. And it becomes this, yeah, enormous monument, I think we can think of it as, of sorts in the heart of Vienna. But with the rise of Austro-fascism, his name gets removed in the mid-1930s, and the building is renamed as Giordani Hof. Bruno Giordani is thought to be the first, or was considered to be the first fascist martyr killed in Bologna. So we see his name being kind of inscribed over the name of the first anti-fascist martyr who's being honoured internationally. So the battle for influence is really strong here through these kind of competing martyr stories. Anyway, with the end of the Second World War and the fall of fascism, Giordani Hof is scrubbed out and Matteotti's name is returned, and another kind of portrait of him is etched into some of these walls. But what I think is really interesting, and we see this in lots of the archival documents, we know that Valenti, who I showed you before, who was behind that push for the monument in New York, he was writing to Matteotti's widow back in Italy. And she was really thanking him for being kind of a custodian of Matteotti's memory at a time when Italy kind of couldn't openly commemorate him. And this idea of the duty of memory kind of internationally at a time when nationally it can't be honoured seems to kind of come back. I was really struck by the parallels that we have. I showed you at the start of my talk the image of the laying of flowers at the site of the kidnap. And I was struck recently when we learned of Navalny's death in Russia by how it seems to me that there's a kind of second and parallel story going on here in terms of international communities laying flowers as an act of like symbolic resistance through memory around the world. So just to show you a few photos, this one is, oh, I wrote this down, basically all around Europe. I think this one is London. Oh no, it's gone backwards. That's so annoying. I might just try and skip that out of the way. But we've got, yeah, London, Madrid, Stockholm, Berlin, etc. I just couldn't help but be struck by how similar these kind of commemorative rituals as acts of resistance are. So I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Right, what a wonderful panel we've heard. My name is Luke Cooper. I work in the International Relations faculty here at LSE, and I've been asked to have a difficult job following a number of historians and archivists who have put together this wonderful granular history and link it to the present day 100 years later, which unfortunately, as we've just heard, is all too easy to do. So I don't know if this is happy or sad or perhaps neutral, but I will try and do what international relations scholars are always guilty of and criticised by historians for rising to the level of abstract generalisations very quickly. But I don't know whether this is happy or sad for you. But I think there are differences in the historical context of the rise of authoritarianism today that we might want to think about and discuss. We can point to many similarities: ethno-nationalism, kleptocracy, as discussed in the Great Conversation article, a trend to driving out of the other in one way or another, attacks on the other, whether it's Jews or Muslims or others, and so on and so forth. We can identify all of those commonalities with the contemporary rise of authoritarianism, and indeed, in many contexts, we could probably call it fascism too. I think one big difference that comes out from the presentations in different ways we've heard tonight is that this was a period of the age of empire, where in the Italian, German and Japanese cases of fascist radicalization, these were polities that saw themselves as the losers from the imperial game and used mechanisms to catch up, if you like, with the victors in the imperial game. You know, the Nazis were obsessed by the hypocrisy and they've had a point, actually, of the British liberal empire and saw a great kind of vengeful logic in reclaiming Germany's rightful place in the imperial game. And we in the 21st century can identify some illustrations of late developers, perhaps, who have adopted a similar kind of revanchism in their thinking. We've just heard about one. But this is probably an exception that proves the rule, arguably, that the contemporary rise of authoritarianism and fascism, for the most part, doesn't see colonization of other states as its means for gaining power in the contemporary international order. The other thing that occurred to me when I was reading the Conversation article and listening to the presentations is that, you know, we live in a much more deeply complex legal order internationally as a result of the outcome of the Second World War and the creation of the international human rights and international order more broadly. And I think that the histories that we've been hearing about tonight speak to that perhaps in a slightly interesting way. I mean, in the Italian case that you will know better than I, you will all know, I think, better than I. But in the Italian case, Mussolini's empire building was really interesting on this score because it actually attached the colonization of African states to this idea that the Italian empire would liberate you from slavery, would declare slavery illegal, would bring about modernity and civilization. And of course, today we do see illustrations of the way in which authoritarianism and fascism similarly instrumentalizes rules-based and liberal orders, but perhaps doesn't do so with quite the same, perhaps, shamelessness of that case, in part because the international legal order has become much more institutionalized, much more complex, and doesn't mean that, of course, it always protects us from these authoritarian forces. But I think it makes a big difference to some degree in how that authoritarianism and fascism emerges. And the last thing that occurred to me, the last sort of factor, I don't know whether it's a similarity or difference or perhaps both at the same time, is that we've heard tonight about a kind of socialist cosmopolitanism that the LSE was at the centre of, and the LSE Library does a great job in keeping this memory and history alive. There was, of course, at the same time, concurrently to that, a kind of fascist internationalism or a kind of fascist cosmopolitanism that the Nazis, Mussolini, and so on were all kind of embedded within and overlapping within. I think you see something similar today, a kind of authoritarian cosmopolitanism, but one that reflects the changing balance of power in the international order of the 21st century. If you want to find that authoritarian cosmopolitanism, yes, you might go to the Skylane bars of New York City, but you might also go to Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Beijing. There's something about the reordering of the international order that changes how that authoritarian internationalism is kind of expressed today. So those were the three generalizations that occurred to me, but I just really want to thank the colleagues that presented tonight and the colleagues that have organized this for putting it on. I think it's really wonderful work.
Okay, mine is the last intervention. I'm going to be really, really brief. I don't have much to say. I don't have a presentation. I'm here. Well, first of all, I shall introduce myself. My name is Gianluca Fantoni. I'm a senior lecturer in modern history at Nottingham Trent University. And I am also the general editor of Modern Italy, an academic journal published by Cambridge University Press. And I am part of this group of research on Matteotti. So I have two jobs here. First is to bring the salute, the greetings of Modern Italy, and to confirm the continuous support of Modern Italy to this project. By the way, by all the editorial board, which, by the way, includes also Amy King. She's also part of the editorial board of the journal. A journal that has recently published a special issue on Salvemini, edited by Alice Gussoni and by Renato Camurri. There was the special issue of November of the journal, which is open access. So if you digit Modern Italy, Salvemini, you will find 4 fantastic articles focus on Salvemini abroad, so on the period of the exile, both in England and in Britain and in the United States. So that just, that this is a statement to the fact that Modern Italy has been following, this story for quite some time now. The other job is to bring you a couple of news. One is that we just yesterday, a fantastic article was published on The Conversation, co-authored by Andrea and I. We wrote it, and it's on The Conversation. It's a very long article, much longer than it is usually the case. I don't know how familiar you are with The Conversation. It's this academic online platform. Usually the articles are 1,000 words. We were given 3,500 because the editors of The Conversation were so intrigued by our research and by our story that they granted us more words. By the way, we used them all. At some point, we asked for more, and they said, no, that would be enough. So it's free. Again, it can be freely accessed. So just type Matteotti, The Conversation. By the way, yesterday I found out that if you do the internal search of The Conversation, if you search and you type Matteotti, there are only 2 results. One is an article by Amy King, again, on Matteotti, and the other is our piece. Our piece is longer, also much better. No,
It's not true.
It's not true. That was just a joke. Okay, so and the other news is that this project does not end tonight. In fact, we want to bring it forward, and we have a number of initiatives in mind. We also welcome suggestions, by the way. But one of the things that we want to do is to write a bid. We are actually writing. We start writing a bid for a grant for a grant to to organize more initiatives like this one and to bring forward the research on the specifically on the Matteotti archive here at the London School of Economics. And I think it just came to me that perhaps I should conclude this intervention by quoting the final part of our articles that summarize the motivation for our and I quote, the goal of our new research is to determine once and for all why Matteotti was murdered. Was it his democratic resistance to fascist misdeeds, particularly the violence and fraud that occurred during the 1924 general elections? Was it the evidence of the Mussolini's government corruption that he planned to reveal to the Italian parliament the day after his kidnapping? Or was Matteotti killed for his international standing, exemplified by the connection to the Labour government that he fostered on that last fateful visit to London? And then again, the very last bit that now echoes very much, but the last slides of Amy's PowerPoint and what Luke said, and I quote again, and there is another motive for our research. By shedding new light on events leading up to Matteotti's murder, we aim to highlight the plight of all political dissenters amid the resurgence of autocratic governments and corrosion of democratic values, including in Italy. By paying tribute to an early 20th century martyr of democracy, we stress the need to understand and address the mechanisms that are still used today to silence opposition and strengthen authoritarian regimes around the world. Thank you.